That Tuesday started like any other day. My name is Margot, I am 32 years old and I work as an architect in a well-known office in the center of Paris. As usual, I got up at 6:30 a.m., long before my husband, Pierre, started to stir in our cozy bed. Our apartment, in the 15th arrondissement, is my haven of peace. Every piece of furniture and every knick-knack has been carefully chosen to create a modern yet warm atmosphere. That morning, as always, I took the trouble to tidy everything meticulously before leaving. I like to come home in the evening and find it spotless. It's my way of decompressing after a long day at work. After preparing breakfast for Pierre and me, I put on my favorite suit, a navy blue that always makes me feel like I'm ready to conquer the world. I took one last look around the apartment, satisfied with the prevailing order, before slamming the door. The ride to the office was uneventful. The metro was crowded, as usual, but I managed to immerse myself in my book, a gripping crime novel that made me forget the crowdedness of Parisian transportation. When I got to the office, I got to work on a green building project that I was very interested in. At about 11 a.m., the ringing of my phone brought me out of my concentration. I frowned as I saw the name of Mr. Dupont, our next-door neighbor, appear on the screen. He was not in the habit of calling me in the middle of the day. "Hello, Margot. I'm André Dupont, your neighbor," he began in a concerned voice. "Hello, Mr. Dupont, what's going on?" I asked, feeling my heart racing slightly. "I don't want to alarm you, but there's been a lot of noise coming from your apartment for the last hour or so. Music, laughter. I know you're usually at work at this hour, so I thought I'd give you a heads up." I felt a knot in my stomach. "Music and laughter? Are you sure it's coming from home?" "Absolutely sure," he confirmed. "I even heard glasses clinking. Sounds like a party." My mind began to race. A party? At home? In the middle of the week? It was absurd. Pierre must have been working too. Who could be on our floor? "Thank you very much for letting me know, Monsieur Dupont," I said, trying to remain calm. "I'll take care of it right away." As soon as I hung up, I immediately dialed Pierre's number. It rings several times and goes to voicemail. I leave a short but urgent message. "Pierre, it's me. Call me as soon as you can, it's important." I tried to call him on his office phone, but his secretary informed me that he was in an important meeting with some clients and could not be disturbed. I felt panic set in. What was going on at home? Unable to concentrate on my work, I decided to go home early. I pretended I had an urgent doctor's appointment with my boss and left the office, my mind racing. On the way home, my imagination ran wild. What if we had been robbed? What if someone had taken advantage of our absence to break into our house and throw a party? As the subway took me back to our neighborhood, I couldn't stop thinking about all the valuables we had at home. My grandmother's jewelry, Pierre's laptop, my watch collection. The idea that someone might be ransacking our house made me sick. When I left the subway station, I almost ran to our building. Heart pounding, I climbed the stairs 4 at a time, dreading what I was about to discover behind our front door. As I reached the landing, I heard music and muffled laughter coming from our floor. With trembling hands, I took out my keys and inserted them into the lock. I took a deep breath, mentally preparing myself for what awaited me on the other side. What I was about to discover would change my day, my week, and maybe even more than that. But at that moment, standing in front of that locked door, I had no idea of the magnitude of what awaited me. With my heart pounding, I turned the key in the lock and pushed open the door to my apartment. What awaited me on the other side exceeded my worst fears. The scene before me was simply surreal. Our living room, normally so orderly and quiet, had been transformed into a makeshift dance floor. The music, a trendy pop song I vaguely recognized, was playing at a deafening volume. In the air hung a smell of a mixture of perfume and wine that almost made me nauseous. But that was only the beginning of the horror. My eyes widened even more when I saw the state of our furniture. Our Italian leather sofa, the one Pierre and I had spent months choosing, was covered in wine stains and crumbs. Half-empty glasses were everywhere, on the coffee table, on the windowsills, and even on the piano. I realized with horror that some had left marks on the precious wood. In the midst of this chaos, a dozen middle-aged women were dancing, laughing, and chatting loudly, completely indifferent to my arrival. Their colorful attire and flashy jewelry contrasted with the orderly decor of our house. And there, in the center of this unlikely scene, was my mother-in-law, Elizabeth. Wearing a fuchsia dress that clashed horribly with our Persian carpet, she was waving a glass of champagne in one hand and holding a karaoke microphone in the other. Her hair, usually styled with military precision, was slightly loose, giving the impression that she had just stepped out of a tornado. For a moment that seemed eternal, I stood frozen in the doorway, unable to react. The reality of the situation hit me hard. My mother-in-law had organized a party at my house, without my permission, in my absence. It was the sound of glass shattering on the floor that snapped me out of my stupor. I slammed the door shut, hoping to attract the attention of the intruders. Gradually, the conversation died down and the music lowered in volume. All eyes turned to me. "Margot, my dear," exclaimed Elizabeth, feigning surprise. "What a pleasant surprise. You're back early today." I took a deep breath, trying to contain the anger growing inside me. "Elizabeth," I said slowly, "what's going on here?" My mother-in-law had the audacity to laugh, as if my question was the most absurd thing she had ever heard in her life. "Well, we're having a little party, aren't we? Isn't it obvious?" The other women let out a giggle, clearly amused by the situation. I recognized some of them, friends of Elizabeth's whom I had met at family gatherings. Now they looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and embarrassment, as if I were an intruder in my own home. "A party," I repeated incredulously. "On my floor. Without my permission." Elizabeth brushed off my comment with a wave of her hand. "Oh, don't be so stiff, Margot. It's Jacqueline's birthday," she said, pointing to a gray-haired woman who looked like she was going to disappear into the floor. "We wanted to celebrate the occasion, and your floor is much more spacious than mine." I felt the mustard rise to my nose. How dare she? How could she think for 1 second that this was acceptable? "Elizabeth," I began, struggling to maintain my composure, "how did you get in here?" My mother-in-law at least had the decency to look a little embarrassed. "Oh, well, Pierre gave me a spare set of keys a few months ago. Just in case, you know." This revelation was like a slap in the face. Pierre had given her the keys. Without telling me. I felt a wave of betrayal come over me, but I pushed it away. It was not the time to think about that. I had to deal with the current situation first. "Ladies," I said loudly, addressing the entire assembly, "I am sorry, but this party is over. I must ask you to leave my floor immediately." There was a moment of awkward silence, then the women began to gather their things, mumbling embarrassed apologies. Elizabeth, however, didn't seem willing to give up so easily. "Come on, Margot," she insisted, "don't be a spoilsport. We were having so much fun, why don't you join us? A little champagne would relax you." I looked at her in disbelief. How could she be so far removed from reality? "No, Elizabeth. The party's over. Now." Guests began to pass me, some barely daring to look me in the eye, others mumbling apologies. I stood by the door, arms folded, waiting for the last of them to leave. In the end, only Elizabeth and I were left on the floor. The silence that followed the departure of the guests was deafening, interrupted only by the sound of glasses and bottles being carelessly picked up by my mother-in-law. I looked around, assessing the extent of the damage. Crushed cake crumbs on the carpet, wine stains on the cushions, fingerprints on the mirrors. Every detail I observed only fueled my anger. Elizabeth, seemingly oblivious to my mood, was still humming happily as she picked up some empty bottles. She turned to me with a big smile, as if we had just had a wonderful time together. "Well, it was a successful party, wasn't it?" she said cheerfully. "Jacqueline was very happy. You should have seen her face when we arrived with the cake." I clenched my fists, struggling not to explode. "Elizabeth," I said in a strained voice, "do you realize what you've done?" She looked at me, surprised. "What have I done?" "I threw a little party for a friend, what's the harm?" "The harm?" I repeated, incredulous. "You broke into my house without permission. You invited strangers into my apartment. You have used my things, drunk my wine, soiled my furniture. And you ask me where is the harm?" Elizabeth had the audacity to raise her eyes to heaven. "Oh, Margot, you're overreacting." It's not the end of the world. A little tidying up and everything will be as good as new. It was then that she uttered the words that would break the barrier. With a condescending smile, she patted me on the shoulder and said, "Thanks for the party, honey. Be a good daughter-in-law and clean this up for me, will you? I have a hair appointment in an hour." I gasped, unable to believe what I had just heard. Had my mother-in-law really just asked me to clean up the chaos I had created? As if it was the most natural thing in the world. I watched her walk towards the door, bag under her arm, still humming that unbearable song. She acted as if she had just done me a great favor, as if I should be grateful to her for having brightened up my apartment. When he put his hand on the doorknob, I felt something snap inside me. Years of little derogatory comments, thinly disguised criticisms, inappropriate behavior. It all came crashing down on me in an instant. I knew that what was going to happen next would irrevocably change my relationship with my mother-in-law, and even with Pierre. But at that very moment, standing in the middle of my devastated living room, I knew I could no longer remain silent. It was time to set the record straight once and for all. "Elizabeth, wait!" My voice echoed across the floor, louder and more confident than I would have thought possible. My mother-in-law froze, her hand on the doorknob. She turned slowly, her expression oscillating between surprise and anger. "What is it now, Margot?" "I told you I had an appointment," she said impatiently. I took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline rushing through my veins. This was the moment of truth, the moment when I finally had to say everything that had been in my heart for years. "You're not going anywhere until we talk about what happened," I declared firmly. Elizabeth sighed theatrically, as if I was imposing a particularly unpleasant task on her. She let go of the handle and turned to me, crossing her arms over her chest. "Okay, let's talk about it. But quick, I don't want to keep my hairdresser waiting." Her nonchalance only fueled my anger. How could she be so nonchalant? I felt my cheeks flush as the words began to pour out of my mouth, like a dam bursting under pressure. "How could you do this, Elizabeth? How could you come into my house without permission, throw a party, invite strangers over, and then have the audacity to ask me to clean up your mess?" My mother-in-law seemed genuinely shocked by my outburst. "Come on, Margot, don't be so dramatic. It was just a little get-together between friends. Besides, you know very well that I consider this apartment as my second home." His words were like a slap in the face. "Your second home? This apartment is my home, Elizabeth. Not yours. You have no right to come here whenever you please and do as you please." "Oh, don't be so possessive," she retorted, waving her hand as if to push my words away. "After all, my son paid for most of this apartment, didn't he? I think I'm entitled to enjoy it a little." I was speechless at her arrogance. Was that how she saw things? That everything that belonged to Pierre belonged to her by extension? "That doesn't give you the right to violate our privacy," I retorted, my voice slightly shaky with anger. "Pierre and I are a couple, a family. You can't meddle in our lives like that." Elizabeth let out a condescending chuckle that made my blood boil. "A family? Darling, let me tell you something. Until you have children, it won't be a real family. And at this rate, I wonder if I'll ever have grandchildren." This comment hit me hard. Our difficulty in conceiving was a painful subject for Pierre and me, and Elizabeth knew it perfectly well. That she dared to use it against me in this situation was the last straw. "How dare you?" I hissed, gritting my teeth. "Our married life is none of your business. Neither is our decision to have children, or when we decide to have children. You have no right to judge our decisions or our way of life." At last my mother-in-law seemed to realize that perhaps she had gone too far. Her expression softened slightly, but I could tell she was still unwilling to apologize. "Come on, Margot, calm down," she told me in a tone that was intended to be reassuring but only served to increase my irritation. "You know I just want you and Pierre to be happy. It's my role as a mother to make sure everything goes well for you." "Your role as a mother?" I repeated, incredulous. "Your role as a mother ends with Pierre, Elizabeth. I am not your daughter and I don't need you to take care of me or judge my life." There was a great silence in the room. Elizabeth stared at me, clearly surprised by my reaction. I could almost see her brain churning, looking for a way to regain control of the situation. "You're ungrateful, Margot," he finally said, his voice slightly shaky. "After all I've done for you. I've always been there for Pierre, and I've tried to welcome you into our family in spite of your peculiarities." "My idiosyncrasies," I repeated, feeling the anger rising again. "What exactly does that mean?" Elizabeth made a vague gesture with her hand. "Oh, you know. Your job that takes up so much of your time, your obsession with order and cleanliness, your lack of interest in family traditions." I couldn't believe my ears. All these years I had tried to fit in, to strive to please this woman, and this was how she saw me. "What you call quirks, Elizabeth, are my life choices. I am passionate about my work, which allows me to contribute financially to this household. My obsession with order, as you say, is simply respect for my living space. And as for family traditions, I have always made an effort to accommodate, even when your requests were excessive or inappropriate." My mother-in-law looked offended. "Excessive? Inappropriate? I'm just following what my own mother-in-law taught me. That's how a family works." "No, Elizabeth," I replied firmly. "That's how your family worked. Peter and I chose to build our own life, with our own rules and our own traditions." I saw a flash of sadness pass through Elizabeth's eyes, quickly replaced by anger. "You're trying to take my son away from me," she accused. "You want to break our bond." This accusation hit me like a punch in the stomach. How could I think such a thing? "I never wanted to take you away from Pierre," I said, trying to keep my composure. "All I ask is that you respect our boundaries and our privacy." Elizabeth shook her head, as if refusing to listen to reason. "You don't understand. Pierre needs me. He has always needed me." "Pierre is an adult, Elizabeth," I replied softly, suddenly feeling a surge of pity for that woman who seemed unable to let him go. "He loves you, but he has his own life now." "A life with me?" My mother-in-law stared at me for what seemed like an eternity. I could see a multitude of emotions cross her face: anger, sadness, confusion, and perhaps even a glimmer of understanding. Finally, he took a deep breath and said in a strangely calm voice, "I think you and I have a lot to work out. But not today. I'm leaving now." I nodded, relieved that the confrontation was coming to an end, but aware that it was only the beginning of a long process. "Yes, I think it's for the best." Elizabeth headed for the door, but stopped just before she left. Without turning around, she muttered, "Sorry about the mess. I'll fix it." Then she was gone, leaving me alone on the messy floor, my heart pounding and my mind blank. I looked around, suddenly realizing the magnitude of what had just happened. It wasn't just the apartment that was a mess, it was my entire family life that had been turned upside down. I collapsed on the couch, ignoring the crumbs and stains, and finally let the tears flow. Tears of anger and frustration, but also of relief. For the first time in years, I had said what I felt. I had confronted Elizabeth. Now I had to face the consequences of this confrontation. How would Pierre react? How would this affect our relationship with his mother? And, above all, how were Pierre and I going to handle this situation together? All these questions were swirling around in my head as I sat there, in the midst of the chaos left by Elizabeth's impromptu party. One thing I was sure of: nothing would ever be the same again. And somewhere, deep down, I felt that maybe it was for the best. Sitting on the couch, surrounded by the chaos of Elizabeth's impromptu party, I suddenly felt the weight of exhaustion bearing down on me. The adrenaline of the confrontation began to subside, giving way to a complex mix of emotions: relief, anxiety, and a strange sense of release. I closed my eyes for a moment, taking deep breaths to try to calm my agitated mind. It was then that I began to think about everything that had happened, not just today, but over the past few years. Memories came flooding back like a movie playing in my head at breakneck speed. I saw myself as a young woman, fresh out of college, meeting Pierre for the first time at a party with friends. His warm smile, his subtle humor, the sparkle in his eyes when he spoke of his passions. I fell in love almost instantly. Then came the memory of our first meeting with Elizabeth. I had been preparing for days, carefully choosing my attire, mentally rehearsing the topics of conversation I might broach. I was eager to make a good impression. And at first, Everything seemed to go well. Elizabeth was charming and attentive, asking me questions about my life, my work, and my aspirations. But as time went on, the little comments began. Seemingly innocuous comments about my career. It's admirable that you work so hard, honey, but aren't you worried it will affect your married life? About the way I run the house. Oh, you always tidy everything up so meticulously, it's almost clinical, don't you think? About our plans for the future. Don't you think it's time to think about starting a family? Each comment, each thinly veiled criticism, had built up over the years, forming a mountain of frustration and resentment that I had carefully buried deep inside me. Out of love for Pierre, out of a desire to maintain family harmony, I had taken it all in, smiling politely, pretending not to understand the insinuations. But today, that mountain had exploded. And now that the lava of my anger had poured out, I faced a whole new emotional landscape, unsure of how to navigate it. I got up from the couch, feeling the need to move, to do something to escape this whirlwind of thoughts. Almost mechanically, I began to tidy up the floor. I picked up the dirty glasses, threw away the empty bottles, vacuumed up the cake crumbs embedded in the carpet. These familiar gestures gave me a semblance of comfort, an illusion of control over my surroundings at a time when my life seemed to be leaning toward the unknown. As I cleaned up, I thought about it. What was I going to tell Pierre? How would he react when he found out what had happened? Part of me feared his reaction. After all, I was her mother. Despite all her faults, I knew I loved her deeply. Would she understand my position, or would she take her mother's side and think I had overreacted? These questions tortured me, but at the same time I felt a certainty growing inside me. Whatever happened, I could no longer go on as before. This confrontation with Elizabeth, painful and uncomfortable as it was, had also been liberating. For the first time in years, I had clearly expressed my feelings and my limits. And it felt good. I suddenly realized that it was not only my relationship with Elizabeth that needed to change, but also my relationship with Pierre. I had spent too much time trying to be the perfect daughter-in-law, the ideal wife, to the detriment of my own needs and well-being. It was time for a change. As I finished tidying up the living room, a new determination grew within me. I was going to have a frank and sincere conversation with Pierre. Not just about today's incident, but about everything I had felt over the past few years. About my frustrations, my fears, my hopes for our future. I knew this conversation would not be easy. It risked upsetting the fragile balance we had established, calling into question certain aspects of our relationship that perhaps we had ignored for too long. But I also knew it was necessary. For our marriage, for our future, and most of all, for myself. I sat down at the kitchen table, took out a notepad and a pen and began to write. I wanted to put my thoughts in order, to put in black and white everything I felt, everything I wanted to say to Pierre. The words flowed onto the paper, releasing years of unspoken words and silent commitments. I wrote about the pressure I felt to be the perfect daughter-in-law, about how Elizabeth's constant comments had undermined my self-confidence. I wrote about my love for Pierre, about the life we had built together, but also about my need to be more than the wife of or the daughter-in-law of. I wrote about my desire to have children, but also about my fear that Elizabeth's invasive presence would disrupt our future family life. As I wrote, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Each word on paper was like a pebble extracted from the mountain of frustration I had carried for so long. I realized that, whatever happened, this conversation with Pierre was a necessary step toward a more authentic and fulfilling life. As I finished my letter, I heard the key turn in the lock. My heart leapt in my chest. Pierre was back. The moment of truth had arrived. I quickly put the notepad away in a drawer. Although I had intended to have this conversation tonight, I wanted to hear first what Pierre had to say about the incident with his mother. I wanted to see his reaction, to understand his position before revealing the extent of my feelings. "Margot," called Pierre from the doorway. "Are you there?" "In the kitchen," I replied, feeling a slight lump in my throat. I heard his footsteps approaching and suddenly there he was, standing in the doorway. His face wore a worried expression, his eyes scanning the room quickly as if he expected to find some damage. "My mother called me," he said without preamble. "She told me there had been an incident." I took a deep breath. It was time. The development of this conversation would probably define the future of our relationship, of our family. Peter, I began, trying to remain calm and collected, we need to talk. A lot has happened today and I think it's time we had a serious talk. Not just about your mother, but about us, about our future. I saw a glint of concern in his eyes, but also a kind of resignation, as if he had always known this moment would eventually come. Okay, he said quietly, sitting down across from me at the kitchen table. I'm listening. And so, as the sun began to decline over the horizon, bathing our kitchen in soft golden light, I began to speak. Opening my heart to the man I loved, hoping that he would understand, that he would listen, and that together we could chart a new course for our future. The sun had long since set, bathing our kitchen in the soft glow of the extinguished lamps. Pierre and I sat across from each other, cold cups of tea in our hands. We had talked for hours, unpacking years of unspoken words, frustrations, and hopes. Now a silence laden with meaning had settled between us. Pierre ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I knew well that betrayed his confusion. Margot, he said gently, I understand your frustration. I didn't realize how much the situation with my mother affected you. I should have paid more attention to you. I felt a lump in my throat. It was both a relief to hear those words and a pain to realize how far we had let things get out of hand. It's not entirely your fault, I admitted. I should have said something earlier. I was afraid of causing trouble, of putting you in an awkward situation between your mother and me. Pierre reached across the table and took my hand in his. This simple gesture comforted me more than I thought possible. We've both made mistakes, he told me. But now we have to decide how to move forward. How to handle the situation with my mother. I took a deep breath. It was the moment I dreaded the most, but also the one that could change everything. I have an idea, I said slowly, but I'm not sure you're going to like it. Pierre looked at me curiously. I hear you. I got up, went to my purse and pulled out my phone. When I got home today and found out about the party, I was so shocked that I did something that maybe I shouldn't have done. I saw the concern in Peter's eyes as I unlocked my phone and opened the security camera app. Remember the security cameras we installed a few months ago? I asked. Pierre nodded, increasingly perplexed. Well, they recorded everything. The party, my return, my confrontation with your mother, everything. Pierre's eyes widened in surprise. You mean we have video evidence of what happened? I nodded. Yes. And I think we should use these videos to have a serious conversation with your mother. Pierre was silent for a long moment, digesting this information. I could almost see the wheels turning in his head, weighing the pros and cons of the proposal. Are you sure this is a good idea? He finally asked. It could be considered a violation of your privacy. I shook my head. It's not an invasion of privacy, Pierre. This is our house, and those cameras are there for our safety. Your mother broke in and had a party without our consent. We have a right to know exactly what happened. Pierre sighed deeply. You're right. It's just, she's my mother, you know? The idea of facing her like that, it's hard. I squeezed her hand, understanding her pain. I know, my love. But think about it, it's not just for us. It's also for her. This situation is not healthy for anyone. If we want to have a balanced and healthy relationship with your mother in the future, we need to fix things now. Peter nodded slowly. All right, he finally said. Let's do it. But how do you want to do it? I took a deep breath, feeling both excitement and apprehension rise in me. Here's what I propose. We invite your mother over for dinner tomorrow night. We start with a normal conversation and then bring up the party. If he denies or downplays what happened, we show him the videos. Peter grimaced slightly. It's going to be a rough night. Probably, I admitted. But it's necessary. We can't go on like this, Pierre. We have to set clear boundaries if we are to have any chance of building a healthy relationship with your mother. Peter was silent for a long moment and finally nodded. You're right. Let's do it. The next night came faster than I would have thought possible. Pierre and I had spent the day preparing dinner, rehearsing what we were going to say and supporting each other. When the doorbell rang at 7 o'clock in the evening, we exchanged a nervous glance before going to open the door. Elizabeth stood on the threshold, a little uncomfortable. She was carrying a bouquet of flowers and a bottle of wine. "Good evening, my dears," she said in a voice that was meant to be cheerful but betrayed a certain nervousness. "Good evening, Mama," Pierre replied, giving her a kiss on the cheek. "Come in, please." Dinner began in a tense atmosphere. We talked about banal topics: the weather, the latest news, Pierre's work, but I could feel the underlying tension. Elizabeth looked around frequently, as if searching for traces of the previous night's party. Finally, just as we were about to start on dessert, Pierre took a deep breath and began. "Mom," he said quietly, "we need to talk about what happened yesterday." Elizabeth visibly stiffened. "Oh, come on, Pierre. It was just a little get-together between friends. No big deal." I felt my heart racing. This was the moment. "Elizabeth," I said as calmly as I could, "this wasn't just a little get-together. You have entered our home without permission, thrown a party and left our apartment in a sorry state." Elizabeth looked offended. "Margot, I've already told you I'm sorry for the mess. I don't understand why you make such a fuss." I looked at Pierre, who nodded imperceptibly. It was the moment of truth. "We have proof of what happened," I said, pulling out my phone. "Our security cameras recorded the whole thing." Elizabeth's face went from disbelief to anger in an instant. "Have you been spying on me?" she exclaimed. "No, Mom," Pierre interjected. "Those cameras are always there, for our safety. We haven't been spying on you, but we have a right to know what's going on in our own home." Without another word, I played the video. We silently watched the images unfold, Elizabeth entering with her friends, the party in full swing, my return, and our confrontation. When the video ended, there was a great silence in the room. Elizabeth had her eyes riveted on the table, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment or anger, I couldn't tell. "Mama," Pierre said softly, "we love you. You are part of our family. But what happened yesterday, and in fact has been happening for years, is not acceptable. We must set clear boundaries." Elizabeth looked up, tears glistening at the corners of her eyelids. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I just thought." "We know you meant no harm," I interjected. "But your actions have consequences, Elizabeth. We can't go on like this." Pierre took his mother's hand. "Mom, we want you to be part of our lives. But we have to do it with mutual respect. We are adults, we have our own lives, our own space. You have to respect that." Elizabeth nodded slowly, seeming for the first time to really understand the gravity of the situation. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I didn't realize how much my actions affected you. I will try harder, I promise." I felt a weight lifted off my shoulders. It was only the beginning of a long process, I knew, but it was a beginning. "We appreciate your understanding, Elizabeth," I said softly. "And we are willing to work together to improve our relationship." Pierre shook his mother's hand and then mine. "We are a family," he said. "With its ups and downs, its challenges, but a family nonetheless. We'll get through it together." As we finished dessert in a more comfortable silence, I felt a glimmer of hope growing inside me. Tonight had been difficult, but necessary. We had taken the first step toward a healthier, more balanced relationship. I knew the road ahead would be long and probably full of pitfalls. Elizabeth would not change overnight and we would probably continue to have a difficult time. But for the first time in a long time, I felt we were going in the right direction. Looking at Pierre and Elizabeth, I realized that sometimes the most difficult confrontations are also the most necessary. They allow us to grow, to evolve, to build stronger and more authentic relationships. And as the evening drew to a close, I knew that, whatever happened, Pierre and I were ready to face the future together, stronger and more united than ever.